So we were talking about security. We talked about SSH. We talked about firewalls. We talked about the importance of keeping your software up to date. We talked a bit about two-factor authentication. That doesn't really come into play as much on the server. And we talked about the VPN. And a VPN is a virtual private network, which allows you to just say like, hey, I trust all these devices, but within my network, but we're going to throw up all these massive walls and barriers to make sure that nobody outside can get in. And we make it really, really onerous to try to break into our network. That way it cuts down on kind of the negotiation you have to do with security, where security always wants to lock things down, whereas you as, say, an engineer want access to things. So it's always this trade-off we're making constantly. And before we get into firewalls, we have to understand what a port is. A port just is a communication endpoint that maps to a specific process or network service. Ports are amazing because we talked earlier about the IP addresses and how there's a finite number of IP addresses. But even so, without ports, we'd run out of IP addresses much faster. So a port allows us to have multiple services on one IP address, even thousands of services on one IP address. Now, if we want to see the well-known ports, and there are some ports that are usually reserved or well-known, we can take a look at those. So we'll say less. And we're using less here because it's a lot. So we want to go through slowly. Any familiar ports in there? SSH, 22. Yeah, it's usually reserved for SSH. Now, more of my old school people out there know what FTP is, port 21, very familiar. Telnet, yeah, that's a throwback. I think it still exists, but I don't know if it's worth going into in this class. Let's see. Look at that, port 80, the most popular port in the world. That's what the internet runs on, is port 80 in your browser. Not a lot of people know that. And I won't go through the whole thing because it goes and 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 goes. But these are all well-known ports that other companies or general practice they tend to use. You can still use them, but you run into something called a port collision if there's already another open port. That's why we usually use port 3000. That's not reserved for anything. We use port 8000 or 8080, something like that. But really, there's thousands and thousands of ports. Your odds of running to a collision, if you pick a high enough number, you're usually pretty good. Port 443, HTTPS. Again, that's what the internet runs on. So ports are an opening in your computer. So you can't connect to your computer without some sort of port. You connect to an IP address, that doesn't really tell you anything. You have to give it a port as well. Ports and open ports are one of the more, I won't say dangerous, but things you have to be aware of. So let's take a look at our open ports. We're going to use a program called nmap. So sudo apt install nmap. And you can do this on your machine. You can do this on your server. It actually doesn't matter. And then run nmap against your droplets IP, and it'll give you a list of your open ports. All right, let's do it together. So for this one, I'm actually going to do it on my local machine. I think I have nmap installed. I do. Make that bigger. So I need my droplets IP, and I have not used this droplet enough. Usually over time I can memorize it, my IP address, but it's been a while. So let me pull this one up here and get my IP address. And I'm just going to run nmap against my server, and it'll tell me which ports are open on my droplet. Just clear that out so it'll be a little easier to read. And there, it's showing the ports that are open on my server. Right now, port 22. What's port 22?
SSH.
So port 22 is always going to be open. Port 80, what's port 80?
HTTP.
HTTP, yeah, it's always going to be open as well. Port 3000, why is that open?
Node.
Node, that's right. But it shouldn't be open because we don't need port 3000 to be open because Nginx is actually intercepting all those. So we only want requests to port 22 for SSH, port 80. So what we need to do is close port 3000, which opened by default because our node server opened it up. So let's talk about how to do that.